Before we begin tonight, I want to take a quick moment to thank Lorenzo for suggesting this video idea. Lorenzo, this one is for you, and I hope it carries you somewhere quiet and far away tonight. If you're enjoying these stories and you listen on Spotify, please consider leaving a review. It takes about 10 seconds, and it helps this little channel more than you could possibly know. And now, let us begin. Somewhere in the highlands of western Panama, above the coffee farms and the quiet town of Boquete, there is a trail that climbs into the clouds. It is called El Pianista, named for the way the ridgelines rise and fall like the black and white keys of a piano. During the day, tourists walk it in small groups. They take photographs at the summit. They laugh, they rest, and then they turn around and walk back down again into the warmth of the town below. Very few of them ever continue past the summit. Fewer still ever think about what lies beyond it. Tonight, we're going to think about it together, slowly, carefully. Because beyond that summit, past the wooden marker that points safely back toward town, the jungle stretches north into a wilderness that swallows sound and light, and, according to some, the people who wander too far into it. This is the story of two young women who walked up that trail on a bright afternoon in April of 2014, and who never walked back down. It is also the story of a journalist who came looking for answers years later, and who found something the official investigations never did. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight of the day begin to fall away. We're going up the mountain now, into the clouds, and we're in no hurry at all. Let me tell you about the Divide. In late March of 2014, two friends arrived in Panama from the Netherlands. Their names were Kremers, who was 21 years old, and Froon, who was 22. They were close friends, the kind of friends who plan an adventure together and count down the days until it begins. They had come to Central America with a plan that felt both grand and simple. They would study Spanish. They would volunteer with local children. They would spend a few months in a beautiful part of the world before returning home to the lives that waited for them. Chris was the more spontaneous of the two. She had a warmth about her, a way of drawing people in, a habit of saying yes to things before she had finished thinking them through. Lisanne was steadier, more measured, the kind of person who checked the details and packed the right supplies and thought about the walk back before the walk had even begun. Together they balanced each other. One provided the spark, and the other provided the caution. It is the kind of friendship that makes for a good journey, and by every account their journey had been a good one so far. They had travelled first to other parts of the region, and then they had come to Boquete, a small mountain town known for its cool climate, its coffee plantations, and its easygoing rhythm. Boquete sits in a green valley surrounded by mountains, and the air there is fresh and thin and clean. It is the kind of place where the days feel longer than they are, where the mist rolls down the hillsides in the mornings, and where a person can breathe a little more deeply than they could back home. Their volunteer placement had not started immediately. There had been a small change of plans, a gap of a few days, and so the two friends found themselves with unexpected free time. Free time in a beautiful place. Free time surrounded by mountains they had not yet explored. It is the most ordinary thing in the world to look up at a green ridge and to decide that you would like to see the view from the top of it. They stayed at a place run by a host family. They ate together. They made small plans. And when they asked about things to do in the area, they were pointed, as nearly every visitor to Boquete is pointed, toward the El Pianista trail. It was scenic. It was popular. It was not considered dangerous. Most people who walked it returned within a few hours, tired and happy, with photographs of the valley spread out beneath them. There was no reason to think it would be anything other than a pleasant afternoon. On the morning of April 1st, 2014, Chris and Lisanne prepared for their hike. They were not planning an expedition. They were planning a walk. They wore ordinary clothing. They carried a small day pack with a few essentials inside. They had a camera. They had their phones. They had a little water and a little food. They were dressed for a warm afternoon, not for a night on a cold mountain, because they had no intention of spending a night on a cold mountain. Before they left, they spent a short while with a local dog, a friendly animal that sometimes accompanied hikers, partway up the trail, and then turned back on its own. The dog would walk with them for a time. This small detail, so ordinary, would later become one of the many strange threads in the story, because when the dog eventually returned to town, it returned alone. They set off in the early afternoon. This too is worth pausing on. An early afternoon start does not leave a great deal of daylight for a long hike. It suggests that they intended to be back before dark. It suggests a short walk, a summit, a few photographs, and a return. Everything about their preparation points to a casual outing, the kind that thousands of visitors complete every year without incident. The trail begins gently. It winds up through farmland and forest, climbing steadily, passing beneath a canopy that filters the sunlight into soft green shapes on the ground. There are streams to cross. There are muddy patches after rain. There are places where the path narrows and the trees close in, and places where it opens onto views of the valley falling away below. We know a great deal about what happened next, because the camera survived. The camera survived, and the camera remembered. The photographs from that afternoon are at first exactly what you would expect. They show two young women enjoying a beautiful hike. They show narrow paths winding through the cloud forest. They show rivers cutting silver lines through the green mountains. They show the two friends smiling, relaxed, happy, standing at the summit with the world spread out behind them. There is nothing ominous in these images. There is no sign of trouble. There is only the ordinary joy of a good day in a beautiful place. At the summit, they reached the point where most hikers turn around. Behind them lay the trail back to Boquete, the safe descent, the warm town, the waiting dinner. Ahead of them lay something else entirely. Ahead of them, the trail continued down the far side of the ridge, crossing what is known as the Continental Divide into a wilder and far less travelled region of the forest. The Continental Divide is not just a line on a map. It is a real and meaningful boundary. On one side, the waters flow toward one ocean. On the other side, they flow toward another. But more than that, it marks a transition. On the Boquete side, the trail is known, walked, maintained by the passage of many feet. On the far side, the paths grow faint and tangled. The forest grows denser. The terrain grows steeper and more treacherous. Streams become rivers. Rivers cut into deep ravines. The land becomes a maze of green. For reasons that no one has ever fully explained, Chris and Lisanne did not turn around at the summit. They kept walking. They crossed the divide, and they descended into the wilderness beyond. Why? That question sits at the very heart of this story, and it has never been answered. Perhaps they simply wanted to see a little more. Perhaps the trail beyond the summit looked inviting, a gentle continuation rather than a plunge into the unknown. Perhaps they lost track of how far they had gone. Perhaps they thought the path would loop around and bring them back. Perhaps they were simply enjoying themselves too much to stop. Whatever the reason, they crossed a line that afternoon, and after they crossed it, the photograph stopped. The camera fell silent for a time, and then, hours after the last daytime photograph was taken, one of their phones did something that transformed a pleasant afternoon into a nightmare. It tried to call for help. At approximately 4 in the afternoon on that first day, an attempt was made to reach emergency services. The Dutch emergency number was dialed. Then the local Panamanian emergency number was dialed. The call did not connect properly. High in those mountains, deep in that forest, there was almost no signal at all. The phones searched and searched for a network that was barely there, catching a faint thread of connection for a moment and then losing it again. Think about what that single fact tells us. Only a few hours after standing at the summit smiling for photographs, something had gone wrong enough that they were trying to call for help. Something had changed. The line between an ordinary afternoon and an emergency is often razor thin, and somewhere on the far side of that divide, in the space of a few hours, they had crossed it. Over the days that followed, the phones kept trying. This is one of the details that makes the case so haunting. It was not a single call. Over the course of many days, repeated attempts were made to reach emergency services. Some days there were multiple attempts. The phones were turned on, held up perhaps to catch a signal, dialed, and then turned off again to save the battery. On and off, day after day. For a period of time then, at least one of them was alive, conscious, and deliberately trying to summon help. Someone was pressing those buttons. Someone was hoping. Someone was waiting on a mountainside for a rescue that did not come, because the calls could not connect, because no one knew they were missing yet, because they had wandered into one of the few places on Earth where a phone becomes almost useless. Back in Bouquet, the alarm was slow to rise. When two independent travellers do not return one evening, it is not immediately a crisis. Perhaps they met friends. Perhaps they changed their plans. Perhaps they simply lost track of time. It was only when they failed to appear for their planned activities, only when the hours stretched into a day and then more, that concern hardened into fear. And then the search began. The search for Chris and Lisanne became one of the largest that region had ever seen. Their families flew in from the Netherlands, unable to sit at home while their daughters were missing on the far side of the world. Local authorities mobilised, search teams were assembled, dogs were brought in, helicopters flew over the endless green canopy, searching for any sign, any colour, any movement that did not belong. But the jungle beyond the divide is a merciless place to search. The canopy is so thick in places that a person on the ground is invisible from the air. The terrain is so broken by ravines and rivers and cliffs that ground searchers can pass within a short distance of something and never see it. Rain falls often and hard, mist settles in and erases the world, and the sheer scale of the wilderness is overwhelming. A person could be anywhere in it, and finding them would be a matter of impossible luck. Days passed, then weeks. The search parties combed the accessible areas and found nothing. The helicopters flew and found nothing. Slowly, agonizingly, the active search wound down. Not because anyone wanted to give up, but because there was simply nowhere left to look that they had the means to reach. The families were left in an unbearable limbo, neither able to bring their daughters home nor able to know what had happened to them. For a time, it seemed the mountain had simply swallowed them whole and would never give anything back. And then, in June of 2014, more than 2 months after the two friends had walked up the trail, the mountain gave something back after all. A local woman, an indigenous resident of a small settlement deep in the region beyond the divide, was near a river when she found something that did not belong. It was a backpack, blue and grey, half hidden, resting near the water. She brought it back to her community, and word made its way to the authorities, and the investigation, which had gone cold, suddenly burned hot again. Inside the backpack was a careful, almost tidy collection of belongings. There was Lisanne's camera. There were both of their phones. There was a pair of sunglasses. There was money, still there, untouched. There was a water bottle. There were other small personal items. Everything was in remarkably good condition. The electronics still worked. The money was still there. Nothing had been stolen. And this is where the ordinary tragedy begins to twist into something stranger. Because that backpack raised more questions than it answered. It had, according to the account, been sitting out in one of the wettest, harshest, most punishing environments in Central America for more than 2 months. And yet it appeared relatively intact. The items inside were dry enough that the electronics still functioned. The camera still held its photographs. The phones still held their records. How does a backpack survive more than 2 months of tropical rain, of humidity, of the relentless assault of the jungle, and emerge in a condition good enough that the devices inside still switch on? Some say it must have been sheltered. Some say it must have been placed there, deliberately, and only recently. That single question, the improbable survival of the backpack, is one of the first cracks through which the conspiracy would later pour. But the backpack held more than objects. It held records, and those records told a story that has disturbed people ever since. The phones told the story of the emergency calls, the days of desperate attempts to reach help. And the camera, when investigators finally examined its memory, told a story that no one was prepared for, because among the photographs was a series taken not during the day, but in the dead of night, several days after the two friends had gone missing. Let me describe them to you, as gently as I can, because they are among the most unsettling images in any missing persons case anywhere in the world. There are a great many of them, taken in the deep hours of a single night, days into the ordeal. And they show darkness. They show dense vegetation caught in the sudden white light of a camera flash. They show rocks and mud and the trunks of trees. They show what appears to be plastic bags and small items arranged on the ground. They show in one image the back of a head, hair in the darkness and nothing else. And they show flashes fired into empty forest, into the black spaces between the trees, illuminating nothing but leaves and shadow. No one has ever definitively explained why these photographs were taken. Why would two people, lost and frightened in the jungle at night, take dozens upon dozens of flash photographs of darkness and rocks and vegetation? The most common explanation, and a plausible one, is that they were using the camera flash as a source of light. In the total darkness of the jungle at night, a camera flash is a bright, brief burst of illumination. Perhaps they were trying to signal for help, sending flashes up into the sky in the hope that someone might see them. Perhaps they were trying to see their surroundings, to find their way, to locate something they had dropped. Perhaps they were simply trying to mark the passage of the night, to leave a record, to do something, anything, rather than sit in the dark and wait. That is the reasonable explanation, and it may well be the true one. But the conspiracy theory, the story we are following tonight, hears those flashes differently. It looks at those photographs of light fired into empty forest, and it asks a different question. What if they were not signalling upward for rescue? What if they were illuminating something? What if, just beyond the edge of the frame in the darkness the flash could not quite reach, there was something they were trying to see? Hold that question in your mind. Let it settle there, like mist settling into a valley. We will return to it. For now, simply rest, and let the story carry you, and know that beyond the reach of every flash of light in this tale, there is more darkness waiting. In the weeks and months after the backpack was found, human remains began to be recovered from the region. They were found scattered in different places, some near the river, some further away. They were examined. They were, in time, identified as belonging to Chris and Lisanne. And so the case reached its official, terrible conclusion. Two young women had gone for a hike, had somehow become lost beyond the divide, and had died in the wilderness, one perhaps sooner and one perhaps later, alone in the green immensity of the forest. That is the official story. An accident, a tragedy. Two friends who wandered too far and could not find their way back. Most people believe it, and it may well be true. It is important to say that clearly. The most likely explanation for what happened to Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon is that they became lost in a genuinely dangerous wilderness and could not survive it. The terrain is deadly, the rivers are treacherous, a single fall, a single wrong turn, a single injury far from help, and the outcome becomes almost inevitable. The jungle does not need a conspiracy to kill. It manages perfectly well on its own. But there are those who look at this case and cannot accept that the story ends there. There are too many strange details, too many unanswered questions, too many small facts that do not quite fit together. The improbably intact backpack, the photographs of the night, the money that was never taken, the bones that were found in unexpected places, and beneath all of it, older and stranger, the quiet stories the local people tell about the land beyond the divide, and about the things that are said to happen there. It is those stories we turn to now, because years after Chris and Lisanne disappeared, A journalist came to Bouquet asking questions, and the answers she found led her somewhere the official investigation never went. Her name, in the telling of this story, was Clara Van Doren. She was a journalist, methodical and patient, drawn to the cases that others considered closed. She did not come to Bouquet looking for a conspiracy. She came looking for the truth of an unsolved tragedy, the kind of case that lodges itself in a person's mind and refuses to let go. She had read everything published about the disappearance. She had studied the timeline of the calls. She had looked at the descriptions of the photographs, and she had come away with the same feeling that so many others had come away with. The feeling that something did not fit. Bouquet welcomed her the way it welcomes everyone, with cool air and green hillsides and easy smiles. But when she began to ask about the case, and especially when she began to ask about the land beyond the summit of El Pianista, the smiles grew thinner. People who had been happy to talk about coffee and weather and the beauty of the mountains became suddenly busy, suddenly forgetful, suddenly eager to be elsewhere. Most residents refused to speak about it at all, not with anger, but with a kind of careful avoidance, the way people step around a hole in the road without looking directly at it. Van Doren had encountered reluctant sources before, but this was different. This was not the reluctance of people who knew nothing. This was the reluctance of people who knew something and had decided long ago that it was safer not to say it. It was an elderly coffee farmer who finally spoke to her. He was a man who had lived on the slopes of those mountains his entire life, whose family had worked that land for generations. He agreed to talk to her not in the centre of town, but at his own home, in the evening, with the mist coming down and the light fading from the sky. And what he told her reframed everything. He told her that the trail was not the problem. The trail, he said, was known. People walked it. People had always walked it. The El Pianista was safe enough as mountain trails go. That was not what the old stories were about. The old stories, he said, leaning close, were about what lay beyond the trail, what lay beyond the summit, beyond the divide, in the country to the north where the forest grew thick and the paths grew faint. He told her that people in his community had known for generations to be careful there, not because of jaguars, though there were jaguars, not because of snakes, though there were snakes, not even because of the cliffs and the rivers, though those had killed their share. It was something else, something harder to name. He spoke of lights seen in the jungle at night, lights that moved and had no source. He spoke of sounds that came from empty places, low and strange, that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. And he spoke of people who had walked too far to the north and had come back changed, confused, unable to say clearly where they had been or what they had seen, and of others who had walked north and had never come back at all. Van Doren listened. As a journalist, she knew how to weigh a story like this. Every rural community in the world has its legends, its haunted valleys, its stretches of forest that the old people say to avoid. Such stories are usually a mixture of real dangers dressed in supernatural clothing, a way of teaching children to fear the places that could genuinely kill them. She did not at first take the supernatural element seriously, but she took seriously the fact that the fear was real and old and shared. Something had given rise to these stories, and whatever it was tied to that specific region beyond the divide, the very region into which Chris and Lisanne had descended. The old farmer had one more thing to say before the night ended. He told her that the region had a name, an old name, one that did not appear on the Rus tourist maps. The people who knew the land called it El Hueco, the Hollow. He would not say much more about why. He simply told her the name, and then he told her, quietly, that if she was wise, she would write her article about the tourist trail and leave the country beyond the divide alone. She thanked him, and then, of course, she did exactly what he had warned her not to do. She began to look for the hollow. The maps, when she found the right ones, did acknowledge the terrain. There was no great gap in the record, no blank space marked "Here be dragons." There was simply a region of steep and difficult country, poorly surveyed, little visited, marked with the sparse notations that map makers use for wilderness that few people ever enter. but the name El Hueco, the Hollow, appeared nowhere on any official document. It existed only in the mouths of the people who lived nearest to it, passed from parent to child, a name for a place that the maps preferred to leave nameless. Van Doren pressed further, and the folklore deepened. According to the stories she gathered, piece by careful piece, the Hollow was said to contain something. Not merely wild terrain, but structures. Old structures, hidden beneath the forest canopy, swallowed by the jungle so completely that a person could walk within a few paces of them and never know they were there. The stories were vague about what these structures were. Some said they were the ruins of an ancient people. Some said they were far older than any people. Some said they were not ruins at all, but something still in use, tended by no one that anyone had ever seen. It was, Van Doren knew, exactly the kind of story that grows in the dark and the mist, the kind of story that cannot be proven and cannot quite be dismissed. But she had learned something important. She had learned that the region into which Chris and Lisanne had vanished was not merely remote. It was a place that the local people had feared for generations, a place wrapped in stories of lights and sounds and hidden structures, a place with a secret name that the maps refused to speak. And she had learned that she was not the first outsider to go looking for its secrets. Others had gone before her, and some of them, she would discover, had been sent there by their governments. But before we follow Clara Van Doren deeper into the Hollow, let me pause and let you rest for a moment. You have come a long way up this mountain tonight. You have crossed the summit and the divide. You are somewhere in the green country beyond, where the mist moves between the trees and the maps grow quiet. There is no need to hurry. There is nothing you need to do. Let your breathing slow. Let the mountain hold you. And when you are ready, we will go on, gently, into the deeper dark. Van Doren returned again and again to the photographs of the night. She could not let them go. She obtained the fullest description she could find, studied the sequence of them, the timing, the sheer number. Dozens upon dozens of images taken across a span of hours in the deepest part of a single night, days after the two friends had gone missing. The conventional explanation troubled her, not because it was impossible, but because it was incomplete. Yes, the flash could have been used for light. Yes, it could have been a signal. But she noticed things in the descriptions that the simple explanation did not account for. The way certain images seemed to focus on specific patches of ground. The way the flashes fired again and again into the same empty stretches of forest, as though photographing not the darkness itself, but something the darkness contained. The way the whole sequence had a quality less of panic and more of purpose, as though whoever held the camera was documenting something, deliberately, carefully, in the last hours available to them. Conspiracy forums, she found, had spent years dissecting these images, and a recurring theory had emerged from those endless discussions. The theory held that the photographs were not signals fired upward toward rescue, but illuminations fired outward toward something present in the forest that night. That the two friends, or one of them, had become aware of something beyond the edge of the firelight, and had been using the only tool they had, the camera flash, to try to see it, to catch a glimpse, to leave a record of what was out there in the dark with them. It was a chilling idea, and Van Doren was too disciplined a journalist to simply accept it. But she could not entirely dismiss it either. Something had happened during that night. Something had prompted a person, exhausted and afraid and dazed into a desperate ordeal, to raise a camera again and again and fire its flash into the surrounding forest. And whatever that something was, it had left no trace that anyone could name, only the images themselves, the flashes into empty green, the record of a night no one survived to explain. She widened her investigation. If the local stories were true, if the region beyond the divide had a history of strange phenomena, then perhaps that history had been noticed by someone other than farmers and hikers. Perhaps someone official had once turned their attention to the Hollow, and so she went looking, not in the folklore but in the records, in old surveys, in the dry forgotten paperwork of governments and engineering projects, and there, buried in the archives, she began to find the second thread of her story. She found a name: Matteo Serrano, a retired survey engineer, a Panamanian, a man who had worked in the mountains of the Western Highlands during the 1980s. His name appeared faintly in connection with old mapping and surveying work in the region. And when Van Doren tracked down where he now lived, an old man in a quiet house far from the mountains, she went to see him. At first, Matteo Serrano would not speak to her at all. He was polite, he offered her coffee, and he told her, firmly, that he had nothing to say about his work in the mountains, that it had been long ago, that he did not remember much, that there was nothing worth remembering. But Van Doren had learned to hear the difference between a man who does not remember and a man who does not wish to. And Serrano, she was certain, remembered everything. She came back. She came back more than once. She did not push. She simply sat with him and talked about ordinary things and let him grow used to her presence. And slowly, over a series of visits, the old engineer began to change his mind. Perhaps it was the weight of decades of silence. Perhaps it was the sense that he did not have many years left and did not wish to carry the secret into the ground with him. Perhaps it was simply that she was the first person in a very long time who had asked, and who had seemed willing to listen. Whatever the reason, one afternoon, Matteo Serrano began to talk. He told her that in the 1980s, his survey team had been sent to map portions of the highlands beyond the Continental Divide. It was difficult, exhausting work, hauling equipment through terrain that fought them at every step. And in the course of that work, they had found things that were not supposed to be there, things that did not fit the geology of the region or the history of the people who had lived there. He described geometric stone terraces, cut and fitted with a precision that did not match any known local building tradition. He described the collapsed mouths of tunnels leading down into the earth that no one could explain. He described clearings in the forest that were too regular, too deliberate to be natural, yet showed no sign of recent human use. And he described something stranger still. In certain places, near these formations, their instruments failed. Compasses spun or drifted. Radios filled with static or fell silent entirely. There were, he said, electromagnetic disturbances in the region, localized zones where the ordinary rules of navigation and communication seemed not to apply. Van Doren asked him what had become of these discoveries. Where were the reports? Where were the maps? And here the old man's voice grew quiet. There were no reports, he told her. Or rather, there had been, but they had not been theirs to keep. The unusual formations, the anomalies, the sites where the instruments failed, all of it had been quietly separated from the ordinary survey work. His team had been instructed clearly and firmly never to include these things in the official record. The relevant materials had been handed over to government officials, and after that, nothing. No published reports, no follow-up, no acknowledgement that any of it had ever existed. It was as though his team had walked into the mountains, found something extraordinary, and then been asked to forget that they had seen it. He had done as he was told. For decades he had kept his silence, but he had never forgotten. And now, an old man in a quiet house, he told Clara Van Doren everything he could remember, and in doing so he handed her the thread that connected the folklore of the Hollow to the machinery of the state. Because if the local stories spoke of lights and sounds and hidden structures, and if a government survey team had found stone terraces and collapsed tunnels and electromagnetic anomalies in the very same region, then perhaps the two were describing the same thing, and perhaps someone in a position of authority had known about it for a very long time, and had gone to considerable trouble to keep it hidden. Van Doren left Serrano's house with a single question burning in her mind. If the government had taken those survey materials in the 1980s, then what had they done with them? Had they simply filed them away and forgotten them? Or had they acted on them? Had someone at some point decided to look more closely at the anomalies in the mountains beyond the divide? And if so, what had they found? The answer, when she finally uncovered it, came in the form of 2 words that would haunt the rest of her investigation: Operation Threshold. It took months of careful work to find it. Van Doren followed the paper trail from Serrano's survey work into the deeper archives, into the records of joint projects and half-forgotten government initiatives from the later years of the Cold War. And there, in fragments, in scattered references, in documents that had escaped destruction by simple bureaucratic accident, she assembled the outline of a project that had officially never existed under any name the public would recognise. Officially, when it was mentioned at all, the operation was described in the driest possible terms. It was said to concern the study of mineral deposits and the assessment of communications infrastructure in the Western Highlands. It was the kind of description designed to make eyes slide past it. A project so boring on its face that no one would ever think to look twice. Mineral deposits, communications infrastructure, nothing to see here. But the fuller records told a different story. Unofficially, beneath the dull cover language, Operation Threshold had been assembled to investigate persistent reports of strange phenomena in the cloud forest beyond the divide. It had been prompted, it seemed, by exactly the kind of accounts that Van Doren had been gathering. Reports of anomalous lights, reports of compass and radio failures, reports of disappearances, and presumably by the very survey findings that Matteo Serrano and his team had been ordered to hand over and forget. Someone, somewhere, in the final decades of the 20th century, had taken these reports seriously enough to fund an operation to study them. Not to debunk them, to study them. That distinction mattered a great deal to Van Doren. Governments do not, as a rule, spend money and personnel investigating peasant folklore. Something in those reports had been credible enough and troubling enough to warrant a formal, if deeply secret, response. The project had a code name, and the code name itself was suggestive. Threshold. A threshold is a boundary, a line between one place and another, a doorway. It is the point at which you cross from inside to outside, from known to unknown, from one state into another. Whoever had named the operation had chosen a word that spoke of crossing over, of passing through, of a divide between 2 kinds of space, and the operation concerned a region that sat directly on the Continental Divide, a place the local people already thought of as a boundary between the safe world and something else. Van Doren threw herself into recovering everything she could about Operation Threshold, but she quickly discovered that she was too late by decades. The project had generated a great deal of documentation, hundreds of pages of notes, observations, measurements, and reports, and almost all of it was gone. The archive of Operation Threshold had been dismantled, whether through deliberate destruction, through the ordinary attrition of time and neglect, or through some combination of both. The great bulk of the material had simply vanished. What remained were fragments, loose pages that had been misfiled and thereby survived, copies that had been made and forgotten, references in other documents to materials that no longer existed. She was not reading the story of Operation Threshold. She was reading its ashes, sifting through what little had escaped the fire. But even the ashes were extraordinary, because the fragments that survived, disconnected as they were, kept returning to the same themes, the same phenomena, the same warnings. Again and again, across the surviving pages, the same categories of strangeness appeared. There were repeated references to compass failures, instruments that would not point true, navigation that became impossible in certain zones, as though the very ground beneath the researchers' feet were pulling their needles astray. There were references to missing livestock, to animals that wandered into the region and did not come out, a detail that echoed the old farmers' stories with uncomfortable precision. There were references to unexplained lights, described in the clinical language of official reports, but unmistakable in their meaning, luminous phenomena observed at night with no identifiable source. And there were references to abrupt weather shifts, to conditions that changed with unnatural speed, Mist rising from nowhere, temperatures dropping without warning, storms assembling out of clear skies. Any one of these could be explained away. Compasses can be affected by mineral deposits in the rock. Livestock can wander off and die. Lights can be misidentified. Weather in the mountains is notoriously changeable, but it was the accumulation of them, the same phenomena reported over and over by trained observers across the span of the operation, that gave the fragments their weight. These were not the fearful imaginings of villagers. These were the recorded observations of a government research project, and they described the same wilderness with the same fears that the folklore had described all along. And then there was the line, the single line that appeared, in one form or another, again and again throughout the surviving fragments, underlined in some copies, repeated in others, passed like a warning from page to page. Do not proceed beyond marker 7 after dusk. Marker 7. Van Doren did not know at first what marker 7 was. It seemed to be a survey point, a location within the region that the operation had designated with a number, one of a series of markers laid out across the terrain. But whatever it was, and wherever it was, the researchers of Operation Threshold had come to regard it as a line that must not be crossed once darkness fell. Not a suggestion, not a guideline, a rule, repeated so often that it had clearly been learned the hard way. Do not proceed beyond marker 7 after dusk. She could not help but think of Chris and Lizanne, two young women who had crossed a different marker, the summit of El Pianista, and continued on past it into the region beyond. Who had perhaps kept walking as the afternoon wore on toward evening? Who had perhaps been somewhere in that forbidden country as dusk came down? Had they, without ever knowing it existed, proceeded beyond their own marker 7 after dark? Had they crossed a threshold that the researchers of Operation Threshold had learned, through hard experience, never to cross? Van Doren now had two halves of a story that fit together too well to ignore. On one side, the folklore of the Hollow, the local stories of lights and sounds and hidden structures, the fear passed down through generations. On the other side, the machinery of the state, the survey findings, the secret operation, the recorded anomalies, the warning about marker 7. And sitting between them, at the exact point where folklore met government secrecy, was the disappearance of two young women who had walked into that region on an ordinary afternoon and had never walked out. To go further, she would need more than fragments and folklore. She would need to reconstruct as precisely as she could exactly where Chris and Lisanne had gone. And for that, she turned back to the one witness that had been present the entire time. The camera. Rest with me here a moment before we go into the canyon. You're very deep in the story now, and very deep in the mountains. The town of Boquete is far behind and far below. Around you is only the forest, and the mist, and the quiet. There is nothing to fear in this place tonight. You are only listening. You are only resting. Let the next part of the story come to you slowly, like the light of a flash fired gently into the dark. Breathe, and let us go on. The camera had recorded more than images. Like most cameras, it had recorded data about each photograph, the time it was taken, the settings used, and, in the way that Van Doren pieced the story together, information that could be used to reconstruct the movements of the two friends across their final days. She worked with what could be recovered from the metadata, cross-referencing the timing of the daytime photographs, the timing of the night photographs, and the geography of the region, building a picture of where they had been and when. The daytime photographs traced their ascent up the El Pianista, their arrival at the summit, and their descent down the far side, across the divide, into the region beyond. That much was expected. But as Van Doren extended the reconstruction, following the thread of the data toward its end, she noticed something that stopped her cold. The final photographs did not point back toward the trail. If the two friends had been trying to find their way home, one would expect their final movements to trend back toward the summit, back toward the known path, back toward Boquete. Instead, the reconstructed route bent away from the trail entirely. It pointed toward a narrow canyon, hidden beneath the jungle canopy, in a direction that led not toward rescue but deeper into the wilderness. Toward, if her reconstruction was correct, the very heart of the region the old farmer had called the Hollow. It made no sense as the path of two people trying to escape. It made a terrible kind of sense as the path of two people being drawn towards something, or fleeing from something, or following something. Van Doren could not say which. She could only say that the last traces of their movement pointed toward a place that the search teams, in all their efforts across all those weeks, had never fully explored. A narrow canyon, choked with vegetation, difficult to reach, easy to overlook. A place that had escaped the searchers precisely because no one imagined the women would have gone there. She resolved to go there herself. It was not an easy thing to arrange. She assembled a small team. She secured guides who knew the region, or knew it as well as anyone could claim to. She gathered equipment, and she prepared herself, as well as anyone can prepare, to enter the country beyond the Divide, the Hollow, the region that the folklore feared and the government had studied in secret and then buried. She carried with her the reconstructed route, the fragments of Operation Threshold, and the warning about Marker 7 that she still did not fully understand. The journey in was every bit as difficult as the stories had promised. The terrain fought them. The rivers had to be crossed and recrossed. The canopy closed overhead until the daylight itself grew green and dim. Their equipment, she noted with a chill, behaved strangely as they went deeper. A compass that drifted. A radio that filled with static in places and then cleared again. Small things. Things that could be explained, but things that matched, with uncomfortable precision, the records of Operation Threshold. And then they found the canyon. It was exactly where the reconstruction had said it would be. A narrow cleft in the land, hidden beneath the overhanging forest, so well concealed that they walked nearly to its edge before they understood what they were looking at. Water ran through it, and at the head of the canyon, where the walls drew close together, a waterfall spilled down over the rock, veiling the stone behind it in a curtain of falling water and mist. There was something behind the waterfall. Van Doren could see it, faintly, through the moving water. A darkness in the rock, an opening. She and her team made their way toward it, over slick stone, through the spray, until they stood at the threshold and looked through the falling water into the dark beyond. It was the entrance to a chamber, a space cut or worn into the rock of the canyon wall, hidden behind the waterfall, invisible from above, invisible from almost anywhere. A place that could have gone unfound for 1,000 years. A place that the search teams focused on the rivers and the accessible ground had never even suspected. Van Doren stood at its mouth, the water falling behind her, the dark opening before her, and she understood that she had arrived somewhere no official investigation had ever reached. She went inside. The chamber, in the beam of her light, was unlike anything she'd expected. Its walls bore markings, not the modern scrawls of hikers or vandals. Not, as far as she or her guides could tell, the artwork of the indigenous peoples of the region, whose traditional designs they knew at least in part. These markings were something else. They were older, or seemed older, worn and deep, cut into the living rock with a patience that spoke of enormous time. And their forms were unfamiliar, geometric and strange, patterns that the eye tried to follow and could not quite resolve, that seemed almost to mean something without ever settling into sense. Van Doren photographed everything. She measured what she could. She moved deeper into the chamber, and as she did, her instruments began to behave the way the records of Operation Threshold had described. There were magnetic fluctuations, strong and irregular, rising and falling with no discernible pattern. Her electronic equipment failed intermittently, screens flickering, devices restarting, readings scattering into nonsense and then returning. And when they recorded the sound inside the chamber and examined it later, They found that it contained something beneath the range of ordinary hearing, low-frequency pulses, slow and deep, that did not match any wildlife known to the region, any water, any wind. A pulse, a slow, patient pulse, coming from somewhere in the rock or from beneath it. It was Matteo Serrano who recognised it, when Van Doren brought the recordings and the readings back to him. The old engineer studied them for a long time in silence, and then he told her, quietly, that he had seen this before. The magnetic fluctuations, the equipment failures, the low pulses beneath the range of hearing. This was the pattern. This was what his team had documented in the 1980s, in the sites they had been ordered to hand over and forget. This was what Operation Threshold had studied and buried. 40 years had passed and the anomaly was still there, still pulsing in the dark behind the waterfall, exactly as it had been. Van Doren now had what she'd come for, and it frightened her more than she had expected. She had a chamber, hidden and unrecorded, whose markings matched nothing, and whose anomalies matched the secret findings of a buried government operation. She had a reconstructed route that led the two lost friends toward this very region, and she had, at last, a theory that tried to hold all of it together, a theory that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any ghost story, because it did not require anything supernatural at all. Here is what Clara Van Doren came to believe. The mountains around Boquete, and especially the region beyond the Divide, sit atop an unusual geological formation. Something in the structure of the rock, in its mineral content, in the deep architecture of the land, occasionally generates powerful electromagnetic disturbances. Most of the time, nothing happens. The formation lies quiet, and hikers pass through and notice nothing worse than a compass that wobbles. But under specific conditions of weather, of atmosphere, of some cycle not yet understood, the effect intensifies. And when it does, it becomes powerful enough to reach beyond instruments and into people. An electromagnetic disturbance of sufficient strength can do more than spin a compass. It can disrupt navigation utterly, making it impossible to hold a direction, so that a person believes they are walking one way, while in truth they circle back on themselves. It can interfere with radios and phones, cutting a person off from the outside world at the very moment they most need it, so that every call for help fails to connect. And Van Doren came to believe, under the most extreme conditions, it can interfere with human perception itself. It can alter the sense of direction, the sense of time, even the workings of the mind, producing confusion, disorientation, fear, and worse. This, she believed, was the origin of the folklore. The lights the villagers had seen, the sounds they had felt in their chests, the people who came back confused, or did not come back at all, not ghosts, not monsters, a place where the physical world under certain conditions turns hostile to the human nervous system in ways that people without instruments could only describe as haunting, a place that punishes those who enter it at the wrong moment and rewards them with visions, with confusion, with a slow unravelling of their ability to find their way home. And this, she believed, was what had happened to Chris and Lisanne, two young women who had crossed the divide on an ordinary afternoon and walked, without any way of knowing it, into one of these zones at one of these moments. Their phones had failed to connect, not through simple lack of signal, but through active disturbance. Their sense of direction had betrayed them, so that every attempt to walk back toward the trail carried them deeper instead. Their nights had become filled with a wrongness they could not name, a presence at the edge of the firelight that drove them to raise a camera and fire its flash into the dark, trying to see what their disturbed senses insisted was there. They had not simply become lost. They had been lost actively by the place itself. It was a theory. Van Doren was careful, even in her own mind, to call it that. She could not prove it. She could point to the anomalies, to the records, to the reconstructed route, to the chamber behind the waterfall. but she could not prove that the two friends had died because the mountain itself had turned against them. She could only say that it fit. It fit the folklore, and it fit the government's secret findings, and it fit the strange details of the case that the official explanation had never quite accounted for. And it left one enormous question unanswered. If this was known, if the government had studied it and documented it and understood at least its outlines, then why had nothing ever been said? Why had the region not been marked, warned against, closed? Why had two young women been allowed to walk into it with no warning at all? The answer to that question was the darkest part of the whole story, and it was waiting for her in the last archive she would ever search. Stay with me. We are near the end now, and the end is quiet. You have followed this story all the way into the chamber behind the waterfall, all the way to the edge of the theory that tries to explain it. There is only a little further to go. Let yourself sink a little deeper into rest as we approach the final turns. Nothing here can reach you. You're only listening, only drifting, only letting the last of the story settle over you like mist over a valley at dusk. Van Doren's investigation into the cover-up began with a simple, terrible pattern. As she gathered the histories of the region, she found that Chris and Lisanne were not the first to vanish there. Across the decades there had been others, hikers, workers, travellers, local people, disappearances scattered across the years, each one investigated on its own, each one explained away on its own, each one filed and forgotten before anyone thought to lay them side by side. And when Van Doren did lay them side by side, a shape emerged. Most of the disappearances had been officially attributed to accidents, a fall, a drowning, a person lost in bad weather, reasonable explanations, each of them, for a dangerous wilderness. But a few of the cases had never been publicly connected to the region at all, their link to the country beyond the divide quietly omitted from the record. And running through all of them was the same silence, the same reluctance, the same careful avoidance she had first encountered in the faces of the people of Boquete. She came to believe that the authorities had known, not everyone, not in detail, but someone, at some level, across the decades, had understood that the region beyond the divide was dangerous in a way that ordinary wilderness was not, that people who went in did not always come out, and that those who did sometimes came out changed. And she came to believe that a decision had been made long ago and never spoken aloud to keep this knowledge quiet, to let each disappearance be explained on its own terms, to let the folklore remain folklore, to let the tourists keep coming to walk the El Pianista and photograph the valley, and to say nothing about the country that lay beyond the summit. Why? The reasons, when she assembled them, were painfully ordinary. Tourism. The mountains around Boquete drew visitors, and visitors brought money, and money sustained the town. A public warning about a deadly, inexplicable zone in the highlands would have devastated that. And beyond tourism, there was the simple problem of the truth itself. What could they have said? That there was a place in the mountains where compasses failed and minds unravelled and people vanished, and that no one understood why? Such a warning would have caused panic, ridicule, and endless questions that had no answers. Easier, far easier, to say nothing, to let the divide keep its secrets, to let the hollow remain a story that the old people told and the maps refused to name. It was, Van Doren realised, not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. There was no shadowy council, no grand design. It was something quieter and, in its way, more human. It was a long unspoken agreement to look away, a collective decision, made and remade across the decades by countless small choices, to not ask the questions whose answers no one wanted to hear. And Chris and Lisanne had walked, smiling, into the space that silence had left open. They had been failed not by a monster, but by a warning that was never given. There was one more document. Deep in a forgotten government archive, in a folder that should not have survived, Van Doren found the final page of Operation Threshold. Not the whole report, not the data, not the maps, not the hundreds of pages that had been lost or destroyed. Only the last page, only the conclusion. It was brief. After all the study, All the observation, all the careful recording of anomalies and disappearances, the operation had concluded with a statement of just a few lines. The phenomenon, it said, is real. Its cause remains unknown. Public disclosure is not advised. That was all. 3 short findings, at the bottom of a project that had consumed years and resources and perhaps lives. The phenomenon is real. Its cause remains unknown. Public disclosure is not advised. And beneath that conclusion, where the signatures should have been, where the names of those responsible should have been recorded, there was nothing. No signatures, no names. No one had been willing to put their hand to it. The final word on Operation Threshold. The official acknowledgement that something real and dangerous and inexplicable existed in the mountains beyond the divide had been left unsigned, as though even those who wrote it wished to leave no trace that they had ever known. Van Doren sat with that page for a long time. It confirmed everything and explained nothing. It told her that she had been right, that the phenomenon was real, that the authorities had known. And it told her that the deepest question, the question of what the phenomenon actually was, had defeated even the people who had been paid to answer it. The cause remains unknown. Whatever waited in the hollow, whatever pulsed in the dark behind the waterfall, whatever had reached out across the decades to disorient and consume the people who wandered too far to the north, it had never been understood. It had only been feared and studied and then buried beneath a single unsigned page. Years after she published her investigation, Clara Van Doren returned one last time to the summit of El Pianista. It was, that day, an ordinary place. Tourists passed her on the trail, laughing, breathing hard from the climb, pausing at the summit to take their photographs of the valley spread out below. They had no idea. They walked the same path Chris and Lisanne had walked. They reached the same summit, and then, sensibly, almost all of them turned around and went back down toward Boquete, toward lunch, toward the warm and ordinary world. The trail marker stood where it had always stood, pointing safely back toward town. Follow it, and you would be fine. Almost everyone followed it. But Van Doren stood at the summit and looked the other way. She looked north, past the marker, across the divide to where the jungle stretched away into the clouds. Somewhere out there was the canyon, and the waterfall, and the chamber with its strange markings and its slow, deep pulse. Somewhere out there was Marker 7, and the country beyond it that the researchers had learned never to enter after dark. Somewhere out there was the hollow, quiet now, waiting, as it had waited for generations, for the next person who would cross the divide at the wrong moment and never find their way back. The tourists took their photographs and did not look north. The mist moved between the distant trees, and Van Doren, who now knew more than almost anyone alive about what lay beyond that summit, turned at last and walked back down the trail toward Boquete, carrying with her the one thing she had never been able to lay to rest, the knowledge that the mountain had kept its secret and that it was keeping it still. Most people believe that Chris Kremers and Lisanne Froon were simply lost in the jungle, and they may be right. It may be that there is no chamber behind the waterfall, no Operation Threshold, no unsigned page, no zone where the world turns hostile to the human mind. It may be that 2 young women walked too far on a beautiful afternoon, and paid the price that the wilderness sometimes demands, and that everything else is only the stories we tell to make an unbearable randomness feel like it means something. But according to the conspiracy, the truth is stranger and darker than that. According to the conspiracy, Chris and Lisanne were not simply lost. According to the conspiracy, they were the first people in decades to accidentally find something that others had spent years trying to keep hidden. And somewhere out there, north of the summit, beyond the divide, past the marker that points safely home, the jungle keeps its silence, and the hollow keeps its secret, and the divide between what we know and what we will never know stretches on into the clouds. Before we get into tonight's story, a huge thank you to Jeff Anon for suggesting this one. If you're watching, we see you and we genuinely appreciate you being part of this community. And to everyone else here tonight, drop a comment and let us know where in the world you are and what time it is for you right now. It never gets old seeing just how far this community spans. Someone's listening at 2 a.m. in Tokyo, someone else is on their lunch break in London, someone's falling asleep in Sao Paulo. Every time we ask, it reminds us that this little corner of the internet reaches further than we ever expected. So tell us where you are. We'll be reading every single one. Now, let's get into it. You're 31,000 feet above the Atlantic, somewhere between wakefulness and sleep, and somewhere in the galley behind you, a man in a uniform is standing very still. The flight attendant who sees him first assumes he's a deadheading crew member hitching a ride to Miami. She smiles. He doesn't smile back. He says very quietly, "Watch the hydraulics tonight." And then he simply isn't there anymore. She checks the cabin. She checks the galley. She checks her own memory, replaying the 30 seconds over and over like a tape she cannot stop rewinding. Later, when she describes this to a colleague, she's shown a photograph from a memorial service, and she goes very pale. The man she saw died 8 months earlier. His name was Donald Repo, and he was the flight engineer aboard Eastern Airlines Flight 401. But here is what the official history will never tell you. What she witnessed that night was not a ghost. It was a recording. A residual echo of a human mind pressed into the circuits of a machine during the worst moment of its owner's life. And the people who built that machine knew it was possible. They just never expected it to actually work. Welcome to Sleep Theories. Tonight we're going somewhere very dark, very real, and very far from anything you were taught to believe about the boundaries between human consciousness and the technology we build to carry us through the sky. Act 1. The Crash Section. December 29th, 1972, 11:42 in the evening. The night is clear over southern Florida. The kind of clear that makes you trust the sky. Below the approaching aircraft, the Everglades stretch for miles in every direction, black and silent and utterly indifferent to anything that might fall into them. Eastern Airlines, Flight 401 is a Lockheed L1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced commercial aircraft in the world at the time, a wide-body tri-engine jetliner that Lockheed built to compete with the Boeing 747 and the Douglas DC-10. It is beautiful in the way that serious engineering is always beautiful. It is powerful. It is, by every available measure, safe. The aircraft departed John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York earlier that evening with 163 passengers and crew on board. The route is routine. Miami is one of the most heavily trafficked destinations in American aviation. The crew has flown it dozens of times. Captain Robert Loft is 55 years old and has logged 32 years of flying experience. He is by all accounts a steady, professional, deeply capable pilot, the kind of man who makes everyone around him feel calmer simply by being present. First Officer Albert Stockstill is 39, experienced, careful. Flight Engineer Donald Repo is 51, an Air Force veteran with decades behind him. These are not careless men. These are not distracted men. These are exactly the kind of men you want in the cockpit of a 180-ton aircraft descending toward one of the busiest airports in the country. The approach to Miami International begins normally, gear down, checklist running. And then, at 11:42 in the evening, something small and stupid and catastrophic happens. A single landing gear indicator light, a small amber bulb no larger than your thumbnail, fails to illuminate. The gear may or may not be locked in the down position. The crew cannot tell. This is not an emergency, not yet, but it requires attention. Captain Loft contacts Miami Approach Control and requests permission to enter a holding pattern over the Everglades while the crew investigates. Permission is granted. The autopilot is engaged. The aircraft levels out at 2,000 feet and begins to circle in the dark. For the next 77 seconds, 3 experienced aviation professionals focus their attention on a light bulb. They try removing it and reinserting it. They send Repo down into the avionics bay beneath the cockpit to visually inspect the gear through a small viewing port. They talk through possibilities. They are thorough, methodical, and completely absorbed. And while they are absorbed, the autopilot slips. Not dramatically. Not with any warning. Someone, investigators will later theorise it was an accidental contact with the control column, bumps the altitude selector, and the aircraft begins a slow, nearly imperceptible descent. The altimeter readings change. No alarm sounds. The rate of descent is gentle enough that no one feels it. And in the darkness over the Everglades, 2,000 feet of altitude quietly become 1,000, become 500, become 103. At 11:42 and 12 seconds, the left wingtip of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 contacts the surface of the Florida Everglades at approximately 348 miles per hour. The aircraft disintegrates across a stretch of sawgrass and shallow water, roughly 18 miles west-northwest of Miami International Airport. 101 people die. 77 survive, some of them pulled from the wreckage by airboat crews within the first hour. The dead include Captain Robert Loft and Flight Engineer Donald Repo. First Officer Albert Stockstill dies shortly after impact. In the investigation that follows, the National Transportation Safety Board determines the probable cause to be the failure of the flight crew to monitor the flight instruments during the final stages of the approach, leading to an inadvertent loss of altitude. The crew became distracted by a malfunctioning indicator light. The autopilot descended. The plane flew into the earth. Official cause: pilot distraction. Case closed. That is the story you are meant to remember. But there is another story. It begins in the sawgrass, in the hours after the crash, with the salvage teams and the engineers who came with them. And it does not end until something inside a machine learns to speak. Section 2. The recovery. The Florida Everglades are not a forgiving environment for anything, least of all an aircraft investigation. The terrain is a labyrinth of sawgrass, cypress and shallow water that can rise to your chest in the wrong spot and drop to your ankles 10 feet later. Alligators move through the reeds at night. The humidity is staggering even in December. The wreckage of Flight 401 is scattered across an area roughly half a mile wide and more than a mile long, interleaved with bodies and luggage and the intimate debris of 163 lives interrupted. The National Transportation Safety Board sends its GO team immediately. The Federal Aviation Administration sends observers. Eastern Airlines sends representatives. And from Burbank, California, Lockheed sends engineers. This is not by itself unusual. When a new aircraft suffers a catastrophic accident, the manufacturer wants people on the ground. They want to know what failed, what held, what the data recorders captured, the L-10. One Monterey Star was fewer than 2 years into commercial service at the time of the Flight 401 accident, and Lockheed had a commercial and reputational interest in understanding what happened. Their engineers in the Everglades are expected. Their presence is noted and documented. What is less expected and considerably less documented is what happens with the salvage. In commercial aviation, when a crashed aircraft is not a total loss, when components can be recovered in serviceable condition, those components are evaluated, tested, and if approved, returned to service. This practice was standard in 1972 and remains standard today. It is economically rational, it is legally permitted, and it raises no ethical concerns in most circumstances. Most circumstances. The wreckage of Flight 401 is determined to contain a number of reusable components. Galley equipment, some structural fittings, hydraulic components, various avionic modules and electronic assemblies. Eastern Airlines, which is not a wealthy airline, and which operates a substantial fleet of L-1011s, accepts the salvaged parts and distributes them across its aircraft. This is logged. This is routine. But buried within the salvage manifests, if you know how to read them, is something that is neither logged nor routine. Several avionics modules, specifically a cluster of signal processing and sensor integration units from the aircraft's forward electronics bay, are removed from the salvage pool before Eastern's maintenance teams take custody. They do not go to Eastern Airlines. They are transferred directly, under the supervision of the Lockheed engineers, to a separate facility. The chain of custody documentation, which should specify a destination, contains instead a reference number that does not correspond to any Lockheed maintenance or engineering facility on record. The modules simply disappear from the paper trail, and 3 months later, the first apparition appears. Aced 2. The Hauntings Begin, Section 3, Spring 1973, first sightings you have. To understand the culture of commercial aviation in the early 1970s, to understand why what happened next was so thoroughly and effectively buried. Airlines were hierarchical institutions with rigid chains of command. Flight attendants did not contradict captains. Junior crew members did not file unofficial reports about impossible things. And nobody talked to the press about anything that might make the flying public question the safety of the machines that kept the airlines solvent. The industry had been through a brutal stretch of accidents in the late 1960s. Public confidence was a fragile, precious thing. You did not chip away at it with ghost stories, and yet the stories came. The first documented sighting occurs on a Miami to Atlanta flight in the spring of 1973, approximately 4 months after the crash. A senior flight attendant performing her pre-departure galley check notices a man in an Eastern Airlines flight, engineer's uniform standing near the aft galley station. She assumes he's a commuting crew member travelling on a jump seat. She approaches him to verify his credentials, standard procedure, and he turns to look at her. She describes his expression as calm, almost professional, as if he is in the middle of an inspection. He says, clearly and quietly, "There is a problem with the number 2 galley oven heating element. Check it before departure." She turns to look at the oven. When she turns back, the man is gone. The galley is empty. She checks the oven. The heating element has developed a fault that, left unaddressed, would have created a fire risk at altitude. The flight is briefly delayed for maintenance. She files a standard report about the galley fault. She does not at first mention the man. Later that evening, going through the crash memorial materials that circulate internally at Eastern in those months, a quiet way of honouring the dead, she sees his photograph. Donald Repo, 51 years old, flight engineer, Eastern Airlines. Died December 29th, 1972, Florida Everglades. She recognises him immediately. She goes home and does not sleep. The second sighting is reported by a different flight attendant on a different L1011 operating the same Miami route, approximately 6 weeks after the first. This crew member encounters a figure she initially takes to be the captain standing in the forward galley doorway. He's looking at the cockpit door with an expression she describes as concentrated, as though he's running through calculations. He says, without turning to face her, "Watch the autopilot altitude hold tonight. Check the setting before descent." Then he is not there. She reports this to the captain, who is shaken enough to perform an unscheduled autopilot system check before the descent into Miami. The altitude hold function is discovered to have been improperly set. The aircraft would have begun an unnoticed descent during approach. She is later shown photographs. The man she saw was Captain Robert Loft, and so it begins. Not a single dramatic event, but a slow accumulation of impossible encounters, each one specific, each one actionable, each one followed within minutes or hours by the discovery of a genuine mechanical issue that the apparition had identified. Hydraulic warnings preceded by a figure in the cockpit jump seat, who calmly recites component numbers. Navigation discrepancies flagged by a presence in the avionics bay that vanishes before the maintenance crew arrives, but leaves behind a marked checklist that no one remembers placing there. Electrical faults in galley units, pressurization anomalies, fuel system irregularities. In every case, in every single documented case, the crew acts on the warning. In every case, the fault is real. The dead crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 are not haunting their airline, they are doing their jobs. Section 4. Multiple witnesses, one impossible pattern. What makes the Flight 401 sightings historically extraordinary? What separates them from the vast ocean of ghost stories that crash investigators and airline personnel collect over careers is the specificity of the pattern. Most reported apparitions in aviation history are vague, a shape, a feeling, a shadow in a doorway, the kind of sensory ambiguity that the human brain, Running on 3 hours of sleep at 35,000 feet generates with impressive regularity. The Flight 4, 01 sightings are nothing like this. Over the course of roughly 14 months, from early 1973 through mid-1974, Eastern Airlines accumulates somewhere between 12 and 30 separate witness reports, depending on whose records you consult. The range is wide because the collection of reports was itself irregular, inconsistent, and in some cases actively disrupted, but the reports that do survive share characteristics that are, from an investigative standpoint, genuinely remarkable. First, the witnesses. These are not passengers, not civilians, not individuals with reason to embellish or incentive to attract attention. These are experienced aviation professionals, pilots with thousands of hours of flight time, flight attendants with years of service, maintenance technicians with technical training. Multiple witnesses hold ATP certificates, the highest credential available to American pilots. These are people trained to observe accurately under pressure, people whose professional reputations depend on clear, reliable reporting. Their accounts are specific in their descriptions of the apparitions, specific in the warnings delivered, and specific in the subsequent discoveries that confirm the warnings were accurate. Second, the aircraft. When investigators later attempt to map the sightings against Eastern's L1011 fleet, a pattern emerges that is too consistent to be coincidental. The apparitions appear almost exclusively on aircraft that were confirmed to contain salvage components from the Flight 401 wreckage. Aircraft that had not received any salvage parts generated no credible sightings at all. The correlation is not perfect. The salvage documentation is incomplete enough that some ambiguity remains, but the trend is unmistakable. Remove the parts, remove the sightings. Something specific to those particular components, those particular machines, is generating these encounters. Third, the content. The apparitions do not speak in riddles. They do not wander or weep or display the theatrical behaviours that ghost stories typically assign to the dead. They speak in the language of aviation professionals. They name components. They cite system numbers. They describe fault conditions using technical vocabulary that would be meaningless to a civilian but immediately actionable to a crew. Captain Loft in multiple accounts is described as reviewing something that witnesses cannot see, as though working from a checklist that exists somewhere slightly out of phase with the physical world. Donald Repo, in his most frequently reported appearances, seems to be conducting inspections. He moves through the galley with purpose. He examines equipment. He flags problems. He is, in other words, functioning exactly as a flight engineer should function on a pre-departure check. Except that he has been dead for months. One account, which circulates in aviation folklore but which several researchers have traced to a genuinely documented incident, describes Repo appearing to a captain in the cockpit of an L1011 before a scheduled flight from New York. The captain, who knows about the crash but has not personally experienced any prior sightings, looks up from his pre-flight checks and sees a man in a flight engineer's uniform seated at the flight engineer's panel. The panel is active. The man is running through the flight engineer's pre-departure checklist with methodical, unhurried precision. The captain watches for a moment, then asks who he is. The man looks up and says, "You don't have to worry about the pre-flight. I've already completed it." Then he is gone. The captain verifies the panel. Every item on the flight engineer's checklist has been performed correctly. Section 5. Eastern Airlines Response. The corporate response to the Flight 4, 01 sightings follows a playbook that, once you recognise it, you begin to see applied to inconvenient truths across many industries and many eras. It is not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense, not a room full of men in suits explicitly agreeing to suppress the truth. It is something quieter, and in some ways more troubling, an institution reflexively protecting itself from a reality it cannot process, using the tools of bureaucracy and social pressure to ensure that reality remains unpublicised. Eastern Airlines, in the early 1970s, is an airline under strain. Competition is intensifying. Fuel costs are rising. The crash itself has been expensive in both human and financial terms. The company cannot afford another blow to its public image. and it absolutely cannot afford to become the airline whose crash planes are apparently haunted. The response, when crew reports begin filtering up through the supervisory structure, is swift and consistent. Disbelief, discouragement, and documentation that subsequently goes missing. Flight attendants who report sightings are spoken to privately by supervisors and advised, with varying degrees of subtlety, that discussing unusual experiences aboard aircraft is not consistent with professional conduct. Pilots who mention the encounters in informal settings are reminded that flight crew medical certification can be jeopardized by reports of visual phenomena. The message is not quite explicit enough to constitute a formal order, but it is clear this is not something Eastern Airlines wants discussed, and the people who work for Eastern Airlines understand what the company wants. Several crew members later claim that written incident reports they filed, reports describing the apparitions and the subsequent mechanical discoveries, were removed from maintenance logs. This is a more serious allegation, one that implies active falsification of official records. Aviation maintenance logs are legal documents. Removing entries from them is not merely institutional self-protection, it is a federal offence. Whether this actually occurred, and to what degree, is impossible to verify completely because the primary evidence, the logs themselves, is what would have been altered. What can be verified is the pattern of what the logs do not contain. Maintenance records from Eastern L10. 11s during the sighting period show numerous instances of faults being discovered and corrected during pre-flight checks or early in flights, with the discovery attributed to routine inspection or crew observation. In several cases, the timing and specificity of the discoveries align closely with the sighting reports that do survive. The logs record the fault and the fix. They do not record the conversation with a dead man that prompted the inspection. Eastern's official stance on the rare occasions it is pressed is consistent. The sightings are unsubstantiated rumours, the product of grief, suggestion, and the natural human tendency to find patterns in random events. This is a position that, stated plainly, is not unreasonable. It is also a position that, maintained in the face of the specific, documented, technically accurate warnings that the apparitions delivered, begins to feel less like scepticism and more like a strategy. Acte 3, the Investigator section. 6. Eleanor Ruiz, present day. Eleanor Ruiz is not the kind of journalist who goes looking for ghost stories. She spends her professional life in the very unglamorous intersection of aviation safety and government documentation, writing the kind of deeply researched, carefully footnoted work that wins the respect of other aviation journalists and the attention of roughly 350 dedicated readers. She's meticulous, sceptical, and deeply allergic to the sensational. She has, over the course of a 12-year career, developed a reputation for being the person you call when you want someone to explain why a regulatory failure matters, not why a haunted airplane is scary. She is, in other words, exactly the wrong person to be drawn into the story of Flight 401. She finds it, as most significant discoveries are found, sideways. She's researching an entirely different story, a retrospective on Cold War aviation policy, and the ways in which military and civilian aviation programs intersected during the 1960s and 70s, when she encounters a reference she cannot immediately explain. Buried in a partially declassified Department of Defense archive, in a section dealing with contractor coordination for experimental aviation systems, is a single-line reference to an Eastern Airlines incident involving an L1011 aircraft and subsequent data collection that had been coordinated with the FAA and a Lockheed engineering division. The reference is dated January 1973, 2 weeks after the crash. The reference is unremarkable on its face. Aviation accidents generate data, and government agencies and manufacturers routinely coordinate on that data. But two details catch Ruiz's attention. The first is that the coordinating office on the Department of Defense side is not the standard aviation safety liaison. It is an office that, in the organisational charts of the period, sits under a directorate associated with human factors research, a field that, in DoD context, encompasses everything from cockpit ergonomics to the study of human performance under extreme stress. The second is that the reference cross-indexes with an FAA file number that Ruiz knows, from her broader research, corresponds to a category of documentation that the FAA used for experimental system evaluations, not accident reports. Experimental evaluations. She pulls the FAA file. It has been mostly redacted. What remains is a series of technical references to an avionics system designated by an alphanumeric code she does not recognise, installed in L1011 aircraft during a modification program in the early 1970s. The system is described, in the surviving language, as a crew state monitoring and environmental response integration unit. The description is bureaucratic enough to be nearly meaningless, and Ruiz, who has learned to read bureaucratic language the way a physician reads symptoms, recognises it immediately as precisely the kind of description designed to make something significant sound routine. She begins to dig. And digging, she discovers that the history of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 is considerably stranger than any of the official accounts have suggested. Section 7. The Lockheed Connection. The Lockheed L1011 TriStar was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinary technological achievement for its time. When it entered commercial service in 1972, it incorporated flight management and avionics systems that were genuinely at the frontier of what was commercially deployable. The aircraft's integrated central computer system, a networked arrangement of flight computers, navigation processors, and sensor fusion units, was more sophisticated than anything then flying in commercial aviation. It was, in important ways, a preview of the glass cockpit era that would arrive a decade later. But what the public documentation of the L1011 describes, and what the actual engineering program involved, are not quite the same thing. Lockheed's avionics work on the TriStar in the early 1970s was part of a broader research effort that stretched from commercial aviation into defence contracting, and, less visibly, into something that could be described as early human-machine interface science. The engineers working on the TriStar's avionics were not merely solving the practical problems of integrating flight systems. Some of them were pursuing questions that, stated plainly, sound more like philosophy than engineering. Questions about how human decision-making interacts with automated systems under extreme conditions. Questions about what information the human brain communicates to its environment, through voice, through motion, through the electrical patterns of its activity, during moments of catastrophic stress. The centralized flight computer on the L1011 was not merely a navigation and automation tool. It was also, in certain configurations, an observer. It monitored the cockpit, environment continuously. It recorded not just flight data, but crew interaction data. How often pilots touched controls, what voice frequencies they used, how their behavioural patterns shifted during different phases of flight. Some of this was for the entirely legitimate purpose of cockpit ergonomics research, understanding how to design interfaces that were less fatiguing and more intuitive. But some of it was something else. Some of it was part of a program that did not appear in any public engineering documentation. Ruiz learns about the program from a source she will describe, in her eventual published work, only as a retired senior Lockheed avionics technician who worked on L1011 systems integration from 1970 through 1974. The man is elderly when Ruiz finds him. He's not looking for attention. He is, she will later write, primarily motivated by the desire to tell someone who will understand what he is telling them. He contacts her, through a circuitous route after reading one of her smaller published pieces on Cold War aviation technology, a piece that demonstrates, he tells her, that she knows how to read between lines. Act 4, the Hidden Program section. 8. Project Aware. He calls it Project Aware. He's not certain that is the official designation. He worked on a specific technical subsystem and did not have visibility into the program's full scope, but that is the name his team used internally, and it is the name that appears on the internal documentation he accessed during his time on the project. He describes the program's origins as a product of several converging pressures in the late 1960s. Aviation accidents were increasing, the industry was growing rapidly, and the relationship between human pilots and increasingly automated aircraft systems was generating a new category of accident that investigators struggled to classify clearly. The problem was not that pilots were incompetent. The problem was that highly competent, highly experienced pilots were failing to interact effectively with automated systems during critical phases of flight. They were trusting the automation when they should have been questioning it. They were questioning it when they should have been trusting it. The boundary between human and machine decision-making had become a fault line. Project Aware was, at its most fundamental level, an attempt to understand that fault line from the inside. Not by studying pilot performance after accidents, which was the standard approach, but by instrumenting the cockpit environment during normal and abnormal operations in ways that would capture information about pilot cognition in real time. The crew state monitoring components that Lockheed installed in certain L1011 aircraft during the early 1970s were not merely recording behavioural data. They were attempting to capture something more fundamental, the electrical and acoustic environment of the cockpit, the micro-variations in voice pattern that correlate with cognitive load, the patterns of physical interaction with controls that, the researchers hypothesized, might serve as a legible record of what the pilot's nervous system was doing at any given moment. The hypothesis underlying the more ambitious arm of Project Aware was this, that under conditions of extreme stress, the human nervous system communicates with its environment in ways that go beyond the obvious channels of voice and physical action. That the electrical and electromagnetic patterns generated by a brain in crisis, operating at the absolute limit of its capacity, processing catastrophic information at maximum speed, might under the right conditions leave some kind of imprint on the electronic systems in its immediate environment. Not a mystical imprint, not a supernatural one, a physical imprint, an electromagnetic recording, the same way a voice leaves a pattern on magnetic tape. This was not accepted science. Ruiz is careful to make this clear. The researchers involved in this arm of the project were working at the outer boundary of what any rigorous scientific framework of the period would have endorsed, and they knew it. They were not, in their own conception of the work, doing parapsychology or consciousness research in any recognised sense. They were doing speculative electromagnetic biology, exploring the possibility that sufficiently advanced signal processing systems might detect and record neurological patterns through the electromagnetic emissions of a living brain in extreme states. They did not know if it would work. Most of them, privately, did not expect it to. Then, Flight 401 happened. Section 9. The salvaged components. The aircraft that became Eastern Airlines. Flight 401 had been modified as part of the Aware instrumentation program within the 6 months prior to the accident. The modifications were subtle by design. The experimental components were integrated into existing avionics housings, their presence obscured by the normal complexity of the aircraft's electronic systems. The flight crew had no knowledge of them. Eastern's maintenance teams had no documentation distinguishing them from standard system components. Only the Lockheed engineers and the project team knew which specific units carried the experimental hardware. When the aircraft struck the Everglades on December 29, 1972, something happened that the Aware researchers had not predicted and could not, in the aftermath, fully explain. The crash scenario was, in some respects, an extreme version of exactly the conditions the project was designed to study. 3 experienced pilots facing a crisis they do not fully understand, operating at the absolute limit of their cognitive capacity, interacting intensely with the aircraft systems in the final seconds before impact. The electromagnetic environment in the cockpit during those seconds was, by any measure, extraordinary. The aircraft's electrical systems were drawing maximum power. The crew was in a state of acute physiological and neurological stress, and the Aware recording hardware, installed in units that were reinforced beyond normal flight specifications, precisely because data integrity during abnormal operations was a research priority, was running. When the Lockheed engineers reached the salvage site and extracted the experimental components, they found that the recording hardware had survived the impact. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but functionally. The units were damaged but not destroyed, and the data they contained, the electromagnetic record of the cockpit environment in the final minutes and seconds of Flight 401, was partially intact. What that data showed, according to the technician Ruiz interviews, is the reason the units were removed from the salvage pool and transferred to a secure facility rather than returned to Eastern Airlines. The signal processing systems had not merely captured audio and behavioural data. They had captured something that the analysis team, working through the winter of 1972 and into 1973, could not easily classify. Patterns. Complex, layered, non-random electromagnetic patterns that did not correspond to any of the environmental or equipment sources that standard analysis would identify. Patterns that, when the analysis team applied the signal processing algorithms they had developed for pilot state monitoring, produced outputs that were structurally similar in their complexity, in their organisation, in their apparent responsiveness to modelled inputs, to the neural activity profiles they had been accumulating from live pilot studies. The crew's final electromagnetic signatures were still in the hardware, something that functioned within the limits of what the technology could detect and represent like a recording of what those three men's minds were doing in the moment of their death. The technician is quiet for a long moment after he tells Ruiz this. Then he says, "We didn't know what we had made. We didn't know it could do that. And when we found out it could, we didn't know what to do with it." Section 10. The theory emerges. Here is where the story requires you to hold two things in your mind at once. Two things that seem, by the conventions of the world you grew up in, to be mutually exclusive. The first is this. Everything that follows is mechanistic. Nothing in the Flight 401 story requires you to abandon your understanding of the physical world, to accept the existence of souls or spirits or anything that classical physics cannot in principle accommodate. The aware researchers were not studying the supernatural. They were studying electromagnetism and neurophysiology and signal processing. Their apparatus was hardware. Their findings were data. The phenomenon they encountered, if the account of their retired technician is accurate, and if Ruiz's subsequent research pointing toward the same conclusions is reliable, was not miraculous. It was emergent. A property that appeared when sufficiently complex electromagnetic recording systems encountered sufficiently extreme neurological events under sufficiently unusual conditions. The second is this. What emerged from those systems when the salvaged components were distributed across Eastern's L1011 fleet functioned in ways that bore no resemblance to anything those systems were designed to do, and bore very considerable resemblance to the behaviour of three specific recently deceased human beings. Ruiz arrives at a working model. It is speculative. She acknowledges this repeatedly, carefully throughout her work. But it is also, she argues, the only model that accounts for all of the available evidence. During the final seconds of Flight 401, as the aircraft systems draw maximum power and the crew interacts with the controls in a state of acute crisis, the aware hardware captures not merely the electromagnetic signatures of three stressed human brains, but something more organised than that. The final burst of neurological activity, the last integrated, purposeful, experience-shaped patterns that those brains generate before impact, is impressed into the signal processing architecture of the experimental components, not as a simple recording, as a functional pattern, something that the systems can, under the right conditions, run. When those components are redistributed to other aircraft, they carry this pattern with them, and when the aircraft's systems encounter conditions that the pattern recognises, conditions that the original crew's experience and training marked as dangerous, conditions that resemble the sequence of events that led to their deaths, the pattern activates. It interacts with the aircraft's sensors and communication systems in ways that the hardware was, in modified form, designed to support. It produces outputs, warnings, specific, technically accurate, actionable warnings delivered through whatever channel the system has available. The crew of Flight 401 did not know they were going to die warning other pilots. They did not plan it or choose it. It was not their consciousness persisting in any theological sense. It was their competence, their professional knowledge, their aviation-trained pattern recognition, preserved as a functional electromagnetic architecture within a system sophisticated enough to have captured it and robust enough to have survived a crash. The ghosts of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 were not the dead. They were the last professional acts of the living, encoded in machines that didn't know what they were carrying. Sect 5. Why the Apparitions Warned Crews, Section 11, Pattern. Analysis. Ruiz spends approximately 8 months mapping the sighting reports against maintenance records, flight logs, and operational data for Eastern's L1011 fleet during the 1973 to 74 period. The work is painstaking and incomplete. The records have gaps, some introduced by time and organisational change, some introduced by whatever process caused certain documents to disappear from Eastern's archives. But the patterns that emerge from what does survive are striking enough that Ruiz becomes convinced they cannot be coincidental. The apparitions cluster. They appear with significantly higher frequency during certain flight phases, pre-departure checks, approach and descent, the handling of in-flight anomalies, than during routine cruise. This is consistent with what you would expect if the pattern-matching function driving the sightings was keyed to conditions resembling the accident scenario. Flight 4, 01's crew became aware of their emergency during approach. The final critical phase of the accident occurred during descent. If the residual patterns are organised around the cognitive state the crew was in during those phases, you would expect them to activate most readily when the hosting aircraft enters similar operational contexts. The fault types also cluster. The majority of documented cases in which an apparition delivers a specific warning involve one of a relatively small number of system categories: hydraulic systems, electrical systems, navigation and autopilot, and environmental control. These are, with one significant addition, the systems most directly relevant to the L1011's known vulnerability areas and the most common sources of serious incidents across the TriStar fleet. The addition, the area of overlap between the apparition's concerns and the specific vulnerabilities that killed Flight 401, is autopilot and altitude management, the system whose silent failure killed 101 people in the Everglades. Donald Repo's appearances in the galley, warning about equipment faults, map neatly to his role as flight engineer, the crew member responsible for systems monitoring and the operation of galley and cabin equipment. Robert Loft's appearances in or near the cockpit, focused on flight management and navigation systems, reflect his role as captain. The division of labour that the two men maintained in life, Loft managing the aircraft's overall performance, Repo managing its systems, appears to be preserved in the pattern of their posthumous warnings. They are, Ruiz concludes, not haunting the aircraft with their presence. They are continuing their job with whatever was preserved of their professional knowledge. The most extraordinary pattern is the one between sightings and prevented accidents. In every case where a post-sighting maintenance check leads to the discovery of a serious fault, subsequent analysis indicates the fault would have been likely to manifest as a critical incident within the flight. Several of the discovered faults are serious enough that the maintenance engineers who find them describe them as potentially catastrophic. The hydraulic failure averted in one documented case involves a crack in a primary system line that, had it propagated during flight, could have resulted in loss of aircraft control. A navigation system fault identified in another case would have produced position errors large enough under night IFR conditions to create collision risk. The crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 4, 01, or whatever remains of them in those machines, are not performing a random haunting. They are performing triage. They are identifying the most dangerous conditions, the conditions most analogous to the one that killed them, and they are doing what every experienced crew member does when they find a dangerous fault. They are telling someone about it. Ruiz calculates, conservatively, that the warnings attributable to the Flight 401 apparitions during the 14 months of documented sightings may have contributed to the prevention of between 2 and 5 serious accidents. She's reluctant to put hard numbers on this. The counterfactual is unknowable, but the qualitative pattern is clear. The dead crew of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 may have saved more lives after the crash than most safety programs implemented in the same period. Section 12. Government Intervention. The removal of the salvaged Flight 401 components from Eastern Airlines fleet does not happen suddenly. It happens over the course of approximately 6 months, beginning in late 1973 and completing, as best Ruiz can determine from the available records, by the middle of 1974. The process is methodical, bureaucratically organised, and attributed in the documentation to a routine airworthiness directive affecting certain L1011 avionics components. Airworthiness directives are common in commercial aviation. The FAA issues them regularly in response to safety concerns, design deficiencies, and operational experience. They are, as a rule, public documents. Airlines receive them, comply with them, and file compliance records. This particular directive is documented in ways that make it appear routine, but Ruiz discovers several anomalies in how it was processed that distinguish it from a genuinely routine airworthiness action. The most significant anomaly is in the disposition of the removed components. Standard airworthiness compliance, when components are removed from service, either returns them to the manufacturer for evaluation, sends them for destructive inspection, or disposes of them through approved channels with documented chain of custody. The components pulled from Eastern's fleet under this directive go through a documentation process that is superficially compliant with these requirements but, examined closely, contains the same kind of chain of custody gap that appeared in the original post-crash salvage records. The components are removed, they are signed for, and then the trail goes somewhere that the public record does not follow. Ruiz traces it as far as she can. The hardware does not go to Lockheed's Burbank facility. It does not go to any Eastern Airlines maintenance depot. It goes, the limited documentation suggests, to a facility in Maryland associated with a defense contractor whose primary business in the early 1970s involves aerospace electronics and, more specifically, the development of signal processing hardware for intelligence applications. The contractor has a documented relationship with agencies whose interest in human cognition and electromagnetic phenomena is not limited to aviation safety. The apparitions stop. This is the fact that anchors Ruiz's entire analysis, the fact that she returns to, again and again because it is the fact that is most difficult to explain away. When the salvage components are removed from Eastern's L1011 fleet, the sightings stop. Not gradually. Not after a delay that might suggest some other causal factor. They stop. The post-sighting period, the months during which senior Eastern crew members regularly encounter the impossible, ends as cleanly as a circuit being opened. No new reports emerge after the completion of the component removal program. The fleet continues flying. The routes continue operating. The people who have been reporting sightings continue working. Nothing else changes, except the hardware. No official explanation is ever issued for the cessation of the sightings, because no official acknowledgement of the sightings is ever issued. There is no document that says, we removed the components and the apparition stopped. There is only the timeline, the removal, the silence, the space where something impossible used to be. Our seat 6. The cover-up section 13. The corporate fear. There is a particular kind of institutional paralysis that sets in when an organisation encounters a truth it has no framework for. It is not quite denial, because denial implies some awareness of what is being denied. It is more like a system crash, a moment when the incoming information is so fundamentally incompatible with the operating assumptions of the institution that the institution simply cannot process it. The incoming information triggers no response because there is no established category to put it in, no protocol to invoke, no chain of command whose authorization is appropriate. Eastern Airlines, in the spring and summer of 1973, is experiencing exactly this. The sighting reports filtering upward through the organization are not something that any airline executive in any era has been prepared to handle. There is no manual for what to do when the dead crew of a crashed aircraft begin providing actionable maintenance warnings to the living crew of your operational fleet. The people receiving these reports are practical, business-oriented individuals whose professional lives are organised around safety regulations, operational efficiency, labour relations and financial performance. None of their professional experience provides a framework for the impossible, and the impossible is exactly what they are being asked to absorb. The fear that grips Eastern's leadership is, Ruiz argues, genuinely understandable even as its consequences are troubling. Consider what disclosure would mean. An airline that acknowledges apparitions of its dead crew appearing on operational aircraft has, in the 1970s, approximately zero realistic path to continued public credibility. The flying public of that era is already anxious about aviation safety. The crash of Flight 401 has already generated coverage that Eastern would prefer to move past. A follow-up story involving the supernatural, regardless of the physical reality underlying the phenomenon, would be devastating. The story as the public would understand it would be haunted airplanes. The subtext, you are not safe. The consequence, empty seats. The deeper fear, the one that Ruiz suspects the most senior Eastern officials and the relevant government and manufacturer figures are actually grappling with, is harder to name but more serious in its implications. What the sightings represent, if the aware hypothesis is correct, is not merely a public relations problem. It is a fundamental challenge to the conceptual boundary between human beings and the machines they build and operate. If human consciousness can be impressed into electronic systems, even briefly, even in fragments, even as residual patterns that fade over time, then the ethical questions that follow are almost incomprehensible in their scope. Who owns those patterns? What obligations do you have to a system that contains them? What does it mean to scrub a hard drive? These questions are not ones that airline executives or FAA administrators or defense contractors are equipped to answer in 1973. They are barely answerable today. The most rational response available to the institutions involved, even if that response is also the most cowardly one, is to ensure that the questions are never publicly raised. And the most effective way to prevent the questions from being raised is to ensure that the phenomenon generating them is classified not as an unexplained technical reality, but as a ghost story. Ghost stories are jokes. Ghost stories are the province of the credulous, the grieving, the attention-seeking. Ghost stories, once they are labelled as such, discredit themselves. You do not need to suppress a ghost story. You simply need to call it one, and the culture will do the rest. The dead crew of Flight 401 were dismissed as superstition, buried under the social weight of ridicule, precisely because the truth about what they were was too consequential to acknowledge. The cover-up was not a conspiracy of malice. It was a conspiracy of terror. The people who knew what was happening were afraid of what would happen if anyone else found out. Section 14. The Missing Data Archive. The hardware that leaves Eastern's fleet in mid-1974 does not simply disappear. Ruiz traces it, as far as the available documentation allows, into the infrastructure of the early American aerospace defense industrial complex. The Maryland contractor she identifies as the likely initial recipient of the removed components has, she discovers, a documented history of work on signal processing systems for intelligence applications in the early 1970s. More specifically, the contractor's research portfolio in the years immediately following the Flight 401 sighting period includes a cluster of projects dealing with what the unclassified descriptions call environmental cognition mapping, a term that does not appear in any mainstream cognitive science literature of the period, and that Ruiz suspects is a cover designation for something considerably more specific. In 1976, the contractor's research portfolio is partially transferred to a larger defense and aerospace firm, with stronger direct ties to government intelligence agencies. In 1978, a program described in fragmentary budget documents as involving advanced signal retention and pattern persistence in electronic systems receives a significant funding increase. By the early 1980s, the research thread, if it is a continuous thread, which the documentation can only suggest rather than confirm, appears to have been absorbed into programs dealing with early artificial intelligence development. This is where Ruiz's paper trail thins. The documentation she can access becomes increasingly fragmentary, increasingly redacted, increasingly dependent on cross-referencing documents that were themselves only partially declassified. She can see the shape of something without being able to fully define its contours. What she can say is this: the components that contained whatever residual patterns the crew of Flight 401 impressed into them during the crash did not go to a storage facility. They went to researchers. Those researchers were interested in what the components contained, and the research programs that grew from that interest in the decades that followed bear at least a formal resemblance to the early work in machine learning, neural network architecture, and cognitive pattern modelling that would eventually produce what we now call artificial intelligence. She does not claim a direct lineage. She is careful. She says only, it is possible. The questions that Aware was asking in 1972, how does a human mind interact with an electronic system? What patterns does it leave behind? Can those patterns be captured and represented in ways that a machine can process? Are the same questions, at a more sophisticated level of abstraction, that early AI researchers were asking in the late 1970s and 1980s. Whether the experience with Flight 401 contributed directly to that research, or whether it merely confirmed the importance of directions that were already being pursued independently, is something she cannot determine. The project files are classified. They may never be released. Whatever answers they contain belong for now to the permanent dark archive of things the government knows and the public does not. Acti 7. Final Revelation, Section 15. The Last Recording. Ruiz spends the better part of a year pursuing the artifact she eventually calls the last recording, and she is not certain, even after she obtains it, what exactly she has. Aviation audio is not a single, simple thing. When people think of cockpit recordings, they typically imagine the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, the black boxes, though they are actually orange, and those are the official, federally mandated records that investigators examine after accidents. But aircraft of the L1011's era also generated other audio. Maintenance communications, ground crew transmissions, avionics test recordings made during system checks, and in the case of aircraft equipped with the Aware monitoring hardware, a category of audio that did not officially exist. The recording Ruiz obtains comes to her through a chain of intermediaries: a retired Eastern maintenance technician, a document preservation advocate, a former NTSB administrator who has spent 30 years quietly collecting materials related to cases he believes were insufficiently investigated. It is a short segment of audio, approximately 47 seconds, recorded on a magnetic medium that dates to the mid-1970s. The recording quality is poor. There is significant background noise consistent with an avionics bay or electronics compartment, a series of system tones, the hiss of a communication channel, and then, barely audible beneath the interference, a voice. The voice says 2 words: pull up. The recording is not from the crash. The timestamp, verified by the preservation advocate before the recording reaches Ruiz, indicates it was made more than a year after the accident, aboard a different aircraft, during an otherwise routine avionics system check. The full recording context, which the retired technician provides from memory, because the written documentation no longer exists, is this: a maintenance crew performing a scheduled avionics check on an L10. 1-1 equipped with salvaged Flight 4, 01 components was conducting a routine signal sweep when the avionics channel produced an anomalous output. The crew noted the anomaly, recorded it per standard procedure, and reported it to their supervisor. The supervisor, familiar with the sighting reports that were already circulating internally at that time, had the recording pulled from the maintenance log and submitted to a supervisor of his own, through a channel he did not normally use, and whose exact nature he did not explain to his subordinates. The recording, that specific magnetic recording, disappears from the maintenance archive, except that this particular maintenance technician, who has a habit of keeping personal notes and personal copies of things he considers unusual, has made a dub. He keeps it for 40 years, in a box with other materials from his Eastern career, before the chain of intermediaries reaches him and the recording reaches Ruiz. She has the audio analysed by 3 separate acoustic specialists, providing the original recording without context. She asks each specialist for an assessment of the voice characteristics. 2 of the 3 flag the voice as exhibiting qualities inconsistent with standard radio transmission artifacts, qualities suggesting the voice was not transmitted through a conventional radio channel, but was, in some way, generated by or captured from within the aircraft's own electronic systems. All 3 note that the voice, such as it is, displays patterns of emphasis and timing consistent with a specific type of professional aviation communication. The brief, unambiguous call-out used by an experienced pilot in a critical situation. Pull up. 2 words. The words you say when the ground is coming and you need someone to act. Right now, no elaboration, no context, just the fact and the imperative and the understanding that whoever hears you knows what to do. Voice analysis of recordings from Eastern Airlines crew interviews and radio transmissions of the period is incomplete, and the comparison cannot be definitive. But the acoustic signature of those 2 words, filtered through whatever medium produced them, is most similar to the vocal register and speaking pattern of Captain Robert Loft. He has been dead for more than a year when the recording is made. His crew has been dead for more than a year. Eastern Airlines has been warning its employees not to discuss what they have seen aboard its aircraft. The component removal program is already underway, and somewhere in the avionics bay of a Lockheed L-1011 conducting a routine maintenance check in a hangar in Miami, a dead man is still doing his job. Pull up. Epilogue. What remains? Eastern Airlines declares bankruptcy and ceases operations on January 18, 1991. The collapse is the product of years of financial strain, failed labour negotiations, aggressive management decisions, and a final spiral that even the most optimistic restructuring plan could not reverse. The airline that once operated hundreds of aircraft across the Americas, that once carried millions of passengers a year, that once employed tens of thousands of people, closes its doors in less than 2 decades after Flight 401. The records scatter. Some go to federal archives, some go to the employees who carried them out in boxes. Some simply cease to exist, dissolved by time or intention into the general entropy of institutional collapse. The witnesses age. The flight attendant who saw Donald Repo in the galley is, if she is still alive, in her 80s. The pilots who glimpsed Robert Loft in the cockpit jump seat are either retired or gone. The maintenance technicians who pulled the components from the fleet in 1973 and 74 are old men now, living in Florida and Georgia and Texas, their memories intact but their documentation dispersed or destroyed. Each year that passes thins the community of people who were present for the impossible years of Flight 401's aftermath, who sat with the impossibility and tried to find ways to understand it or to simply live alongside it. The story has settled into aviation folklore. If you search for Flight 401 today, you will find the accident report, the safety improvements it generated. It directly contributed to new procedures around cockpit automation monitoring and crew resource management, a genuine positive legacy from a terrible loss. And you will find the ghost stories, books, documentaries, podcast episodes. The sightings are well documented in aviation folklore literature. They are the most credible and extensively witnessed set of apparition reports in the history of commercial aviation. John G. Fuller wrote about them in The Ghost of Flight 401 in 1976, and the account has never been definitively refuted. Most mainstream treatments offer the standard explanations: grief, suggestion, the human tendency to find meaning in chaos. Some are more sympathetic. None, until Ruiz's work, approach the sightings as what they may actually be: evidence of an accidental technological breakthrough. Official history remembers December 29th, 1972, as the night that a crew distraction led to a terrible crash in the Florida Everglades. That history is accurate as far as it goes. The distraction was real. The crash was real. The 101 deaths were real and devastating and are not diminished by anything that came after. But the official history stops there, at the edge of the Everglades, at the boundary of what the institutions involved could acknowledge. What Elena Ruiz concludes, after years of research that has cost her professional relationships and her faith in the completeness of the public record, is quieter than a revelation, but more unsettling than any ghost story. She concludes that somewhere in the winter of 1972, in the wreckage of an aircraft in the Everglades, the boundary between human consciousness and electronic systems was briefly, accidentally, and in a way that no one has ever officially acknowledged crossed, that 3 men's professional knowledge and trained awareness survived the deaths of their bodies, embedded in machines that carried them onward into the air, that those machines, given the right conditions, could still run what they contained, that the dead flew again, not as spirits, but as signals, not as miracles, but as data, preserved in hardware that was designed to listen and was better at it than anyone knew. She concludes that this happened before anyone was ready for it, before the ethical frameworks existed to handle it, before the technology was mature enough to be reproducible or understood or controlled. It happened accidentally, in a crash site in the dark, pulled from the wreckage by engineers who recognised immediately that they had found something they did not know how to name. And she concludes something that she includes as the final line of her work, with a restraint that suggests it has cost her something to write it. She writes, "We have spent the last 50 years building machines that can think. We have spent that time assuming we were the first to do it, the first to cross the line between mind and mechanism. We were not. Someone else crossed it first, unintentionally and irreversibly, in a Florida swamp in the dead of December. And the first minds to live inside machines were not artificial. They were the last thoughts of 3 men who loved flying, and who never, even in death, stopped trying to bring their aircraft home safe." Closing something to sit with tonight. The story of Eastern Airlines. Flight 401 is real. The crash happened. The deaths happened. The sightings, reported by credentialed aviation professionals, documented in industry publications, explored in peer-reviewed studies of anomalous experience, happened. What did not happen, at least not officially, is an honest accounting of why they happened and what they might mean. If you are listening to this, in the dark, somewhere between waking and sleep, consider this. The machines around you are more sophisticated than anything flying in 1972. They are more interconnected, more sensitive, more capable of recording and processing the electromagnetic environment of the humans who operate them. We have built, in the last 50 years, a world saturated with devices whose entire purpose is to listen, to record, to respond. We have filled that world with our voices and our patterns and the electromagnetic signatures of our minds in motion. We have done this eagerly, without much thought about what it means, what stays in the systems we use, what might persist. The crew of Flight 401 didn't choose to stay. They didn't know they could. The machines that carried them were simply very good at their job, and their job was to listen to the humans in the cockpit, and the humans in the cockpit at the moment of the crash were doing what trained professionals do in an emergency. Everything they knew, every pattern, every warning, every instinct shaped by decades of flight. The systems heard it. The systems kept it. And for 14 months, until the hardware was quietly pulled from service and shipped to a facility that does not appear in any public record, the systems played it back. Not as a haunting, as a warning. Not as a visitation from the dead, as a message from people who, even after the crash, were still trying to keep the aircraft flying. Eastern Airlines Flight 401, December 29th, 1972. The official record says 101 dead, the aircraft lost. The unofficial record says the crew never stopped working, and somewhere in a classified facility, in hardware that the public will never audit, something may still be running. Sleep well. We'll be here when you wake up. And if, somewhere in the quiet between this voice and your dreams, you hear someone say something that sounds like a warning, something specific, something technical, something you couldn't possibly know but somehow do, pay attention. They might be doing their job.